So we're looking at Leo Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilych. And with that, we're coming to a very different nation. We haven't done Russia at all yet, Russian literature. I love Russian literature. And because we're doing it chronologically, we just haven't come to the period where it would be important or relevant. And to some degree, it's a digression, since most of the writers we're dealing with are English. I'm not even dealing with Americans or Canadians, for that matter. It's mostly British English, to try and preserve some sort of continuity there. I think that the American, there are very many good American writers, and there are some good Canadian writers, for that matter. I'm just not including them, again, for a sense of continuity with those that go before it. And it's just a little bit easier by sticking in the European context. And Russia then is going off the slope a bit. But I just can't help myself. I want to do a little bit of Tolstoy, and I can't read one of Tolstoy's long novels like War and Peace or Anna Karenina, because it's just would be unfair to you, because it's just they're enormous books, 1,000 pages. This is a novella, so a short story, short novel. The form is a little different, I guess. I should say something about the form. I said it was a novella. That's a short novel, but the novel itself is a new form of writing. As the name probably suggests, it's novel, it's new. When I say new, the novel probably begins in the late, some say it begins with Cervantes in the 16th century, but you don't really see a great deal of it. It explodes in the 18th century, the modern novel. And by the 19th century, it becomes more and more important as a literary form. And it's a long form. It's largely narrative in form. It'll tell you a story. Poems don't always tell stories, although most of the poems that we've looked at are epics, and so they are stories, narratives. And historically, the best literature would be written in poetry with a certain style. But they're still telling a story. And in that, the novel has common ground with the epic. It has a narrative. It's a long narrative. There are other narratives besides the epic, but those are the ones that we're most acquainted with. This is a shorter version of that, and I've chosen it because of its brevity as much as anything, but also because of its theme. But the death of Ivan Ilych. And it will pick up the theme that I dealt with last semester when we looked at a different literary form, the drama, in Everyman. If you were with me last semester, if not, it's up on YouTube. But it's about death in both cases. So the summoning of Everyman, the play I looked at last semester, it is introduced with death. Death comes onto the stage. In fact, it begins with God saying that he's going to summon every man to his time's up. So he sends death to him to bring him. So God comes in, calls forth death, sends death to meet every man, and every man is supposed to come back with him. If he does, then the story's done, of course, because he's dead. And every man panics, says that he's not ready, and he just needs a little more time, and can you give me more time? And death says, no, it's not possible. And then it happens, because otherwise the story's over. So then he does things that will help him prepare for that time that is coming. He calls forth his friends, he calls forth his possessions, he calls forth all sorts of things. Nobody wants to go with him, death being a terrible thing. And so then he learns to live his life in accordance with the reality that he can't avoid. Death is coming, are you ready for it? It's a perennial theme of Western literature. Mortality and the significance of it. Are you going to live rightly? Because you are going to die. That much is certain. It's an absolutely perfect statistic. 100% of the people who live on earth die. with a few exceptions, I guess, so it's not 100%. Elijah and Enoch did not die. They were taken up. Extraordinary. But Jesus himself died. He just didn't stay dead. But he did die. And death is one of the most important features of human life then. The meaning of death, the inevitability of death, the way death seems to destroy everything about life, and yet it sort of bookends a person's life in a way that will influence the way they live. Depending on what you think death means, your life will also attain a certain meaning. And they work together. Whatever you conceive life to mean will affect how you understand death, and vice versa. In the case of Leo Tolstoy, he's writing in 19th century Russia, and his world is very much like ours insofar as it has become relatively affluent. He's in Moscow, and there's a burgeoning middle class there. And I've been to Moscow. I was at a Christianity and Literature conference there 20 odd years ago now. And it's very much now the way it was then, in the sense that you are not allowed to come into the city, or at least to stay in the city without a permit. You can't just move there. Where we take for granted that you can, if you're a citizen of a country, you can come to the city and move there if you want to. That's not the case in Moscow. You need permission. It's an imperial city. And without that, you are left outside the city, but the city is the center of Russian life in many ways. And Ivan Ilych wants to come to Moscow because it's the place where the wealthy and the powerful live, but he can't get there at first. And so it's part of his aspiration in life to be able to move to Moscow and have a life there. He'll be of importance. His career ambitions will be fulfilled. And he is like all the rest of the people that we hear. So it's in other words, it's like the, what do we call that? Can't even think of the phrase that we use in English for this. A rat race. He's busy, trying to climb. And he's trying to gain titles, he's trying to gain wealth, he's trying to gain influence. And the one thing that he never considers is the fact that he is going to die. It is a no-no subject in his circles. Nobody wants to talk about death. And yet it's something that will affect all of them, from which none will be exempt. And it's something that is of such importance that it ought to at least be something that is addressed in polite society, but it's not. Now, when Tolstoy writes this, it probably reflects his own day. And I would say it reflects Canada as well. You don't hear people talking about death as a subject of discussion in public. I don't hear about it on the radio. Or if I do, it's because somebody died in a car accident or something like that. Oh, there's this terrible accident that happened. People died. Yes, but not the actual topic of death and what it means. It's called an accident as if it didn't happen, as if it wasn't normal for people to die. People die every day. We don't talk about those deaths. We only talk about the ones that were unanticipated, as if what was terrible about death is that we didn't expect it. Right? That's what's talked about. It came before they were ready. But the fact that it's coming irrespective of whether they're ready or not is not talked about. So if it's such a horrifying subject and it is so important to a person's life that we're willing to talk about it in terms of the news and an accident, then why would you not bring it up in regular public discussions? Right? Why is it never the topic of discussion, other than that it's uncomfortable? We locked down the country and mandated all sorts of unusual measures for however crazy long to avoid the possibility of death, an unintended death. We're willing to suspend every civil liberty. We do crazy things like wear masks and stand 6 feet from people, which is the dumbest thing on earth. Unless you were outside Canada, in which case it was not 6 feet, it was 3 feet. I guess we have more room in Canada, so we can space 6 feet. And they have these stupid things on the floor here. It's 6 feet, you have to stand at a distance. Stuff like made me crazy. It's stuff, and the virus which goes through a mask. I mean, come on. Sorry, I'll put myself back in my box and not start ranting on the stupidity of the whole thing. But it's out of fear. That was the point. It was the fear of death which drove that. People were willing to buy, however stupid the scenario, they were willing to buy it because they're paralyzed by the fear of death. So it's a live topic. That's why I went down that path, not just to rant, because I had to pull myself back from the rant. But the death is a perennial issue, in the fear of death. And it's in part because we won't talk about it and don't want to deal with the meaning of death. Have you heard of a countdown calculator, by the way? You ever heard of that? You have? Insurance companies have it. So if you apply for life insurance, they will come and they'll look into your vital statistics, so weight, height, health concerns, familial health, did cancer in your family, that sort of things. What's your lifestyle? Do you smoke? Do you do drugs? They'll go through a whole list. And then based on that and where you live and what you do and what your profession is, and they will guess how long you're going to live. And they will give you money, they will give you insurance on the basis, and it will cost in accordance with those. And that's the countdown calculator. And that's how they make their money. They can tell you when you're going to die. You don't want to know. Or maybe you do want to know, I don't know. But they know that's how they make their money, because they're thinking, okay, he's going to die at this age, we will insure him for this long, and it's going to cost this much. Because if we think he's going to die early because his father died at this, then it's going to, yeah, you can have the insurance, but we're going to charge you X amount more. Because we don't think you're reaching 50. And if your father died before you, like you outlived him, I'm not sure we're going to insure you. Because they've measured it. So what that is doing is making money on probability then. Because the death is the certain thing. The time of the death is the probable thing. And you can make money in probabilities. It's called gambling. Your insurers are gamblers. And you buying the insurance is also a form of gambling. You make profit off your own death if you have the insurance. Isn't that great? There's a lottery I can win. Yeah, isn't that fantastic? Lottery ticket, no chance. Life insurance, sure. Maybe, but they got all your stats. So, I mean, you can't take your own life. That negates the insurance, right? You can't take out a policy. But it's coming. The death of Ivan Illich is dealing with that discomfort with death because he lives in a society, although it is nominally Christian, and you'll see this is the backdrop for the novella. It's in Russia. It's Orthodox. They will pay homage to or lip service to the idea of the Christian faith and its significance, and they'll bow, and there'll be, mentions of the trappings of Christianity. They don't live as if there's a resurrection and a life. They live in the fear of death. It drives them. And how do you know? Because they never talk about it. Even though from a Christian vantage point, the universal symbol of the Christian faith is a symbol of death. It's what you got around your neck. It's a mode of execution. If you're evangelical, there's no one on it. It's the cross, because he's no longer dead. He's raised from the dead. He's no longer suffering on the cross. There's an empty cross. He's not on that cross anymore. But all of this will give rise to a fantastic theme for a novella by Leo Tolstoy, who was a very odd man. I won't spend too much time on Tolstoy, but he had very odd views. He's not orthodox in his views of Christianity, although he does ascribe significance to the Christian faith and living in the light of that and living in a very authentic manner. So he's Count Leo Tolstoy, first of all. So he's a Russian nobleman who largely gives up his wealth to live in a very agrarian lifestyle, live off the land in the presence of the natural world, and to share wealth and so forth. Very interesting, admirable fellow. But one of the great themes of the novella is that of living an authentic human life. How do you live authentically? Like, everybody's alive, but how do you live your life? Does it matter? Can you just do whatever you want? That's what we tend to hear in Canada. You know, we're not going to judge, you know, you do you. Well, that inane, stupid phrases drive me crazy. In Tolstoy's world, there is a sense of a good way to live a life and a less good way, or even a bad way. But it is one of the themes of this novella that there is an authentic way to live one's life, and it's not the one that Ivan Ilych has been living. He's lived a life trying to pretend that death wouldn't happen, and then he was surprised to find that he died, because that's how the novella begins. It begins with a dead character. How about that? It's not what you expect. You expect it's the story of the man's life, and then the death comes at the end. This novella begins with the man already dead, and others coming to his funeral. It's quite the way to begin. It's not quite a gospel narrative in this, although the gospel narratives, 2/3 of them are related to the events leading up to and after Christ's life. You ever thought about that? This is the life of Christ, but 2/3 of it is related to his death. Just think about the weight of that and the significance of that. It's not just the symbol of the cross. The narratives themselves are already pushing you towards the meaning and significance of a man's death and how it relates to you, the reader. You ever thought about it? Because you think of them as biographies. He was born, because there's a birth narrative, and then there's the teaching time, and then there's the death. But the death is the one that overarches the whole story. Here, it begins the whole story. And we're going to find that it doesn't construct itself the way a story usually does, although it's very artfully written. It begins with the death, and then it's 12 chapters, by the way. And the chapters are very interesting. As I say, it begins in the funeral home with the discussion of his friends and family members coming to it, and all that goes on with that. I'll get to that in a second. But the first 4 chapters of the death of Ivan Ilych deal with the first 40 years of his life. So it begins with his death, and then it backtracks immediately to where he began, and then how he grew up and what he tried to do. And he spent 40 years climbing the ladder, trying to get to Moscow, getting to Moscow, marrying a woman who was wealthier than he was. So he was climbing up in every respect, climbing the career ladder, climbing the marriage ladder, getting to, and never stopping the climbing. He keeps on going. And he never thinks about the fact that at the top of the ladder, he's going to fall off the ladder. And the second 4 chapters deal with the several months that occur after he actually has fallen off a ladder, literally fallen off a ladder, and he's hurt his side. And at first he doesn't think it's that bad, but actually it's a fatal wound. So there's 40 years, several months. Final 4 chapters are about 4 weeks. So what you get is, yes, four chapters, 4 chapters, 4 chapters, but the time span is long, medium, and very short. And the chapters get shorter and shorter as well. But they reflect, to some degree, the experience of life. I can tell you as somebody old enough to tell you this, and you're young enough not to know it the way I know it. Although you know something about what I'm going to say, which is that every year you get older, the years go faster. No? The time has not changed. It's 365 days, or 66 if it's a leap year. That doesn't change. But your perception of it changes. And boy, that year went quickly by. The older you get, the quicker it goes. Which is an odd thing. But the experience of it is real. And the novel reflects that to some degree. And in particular, when you're sick or in pain, time seems to stand still. You can be in the hospital, sick, in pain for months, and it seems like you don't even know when it stopped. And it also seems like it's never going to end. But a sense of time stops. And the novella sort of expresses the sense that death starts to speed up as you come towards it. So it's brilliantly constructed, I think. So it begins with the one thing that he wanted to deny, which was that he was going to die, by showing his death, and then talks about him spending all of his years trying to avoid thinking about it. And then the final chapters deal with the reality of him not leaving his house or home or even his room. He's lying on a bed and doesn't leave it. 40 years of traveling, going around, acting as if he was immortal. Then he has an accident, and then he's in a sort of denial phase. Goes back and forth. Stages of grief, they talk about it. Psychologists talk about the 5 stages of grief, whatever. And you can see those. He's in those phases. He doesn't want to accept it. He'll deny it. He'll get angry. There'll be all that sort of thing going on. And then in the final 4, he comes to accept it. And it's transformative the way he greets death. Not as something because he can't avoid it anymore. If you can't avoid it, then how will you live your life even though your life is confined to a little room? It was very powerful during the COVID lockdowns, where everyone's locked in their own stupid little room. Distressed, but the contraction of time and space is one of the devices that Tolstoy uses to push his narrative themes of living a good life and what that means. Because this is why this is a great novel. It's not because it's about death, because there's nothing interesting about death per se. It's how do you live your life in view of the reality of death. And he changes Tolstoy, Ivan Ilych. And the reason he changes is because a man is brought into his life that he would otherwise not have met, by the name of Gerasim. And Gerasim is a Christian. And Gerasim is a very authentic man. He lives a life in the full knowledge that death and sickness are part of a mortal, fallen, sinful life. And given that fact, we should care for those who are sick and infirm and are terrified by death and try to alleviate that. So there's something deeply Christian about that. And he lives authentically in the light of that fact. He's compassionate for this man, whom he doesn't know. And he treats him as if he were his family member. And his family members don't want to know him. This is also true, by the way. I don't know if you've ever suffered illness or grief or anything. People will express sympathy, and then after they've talked to you about it, then they walk away and you'll never hear from them again. They don't want to know you. It's just true. And they'll justify it to themselves by saying things like, I don't want to burden you with talking about this. which is a way of saying, I can't deal with what you're dealing with. So they pull back from it. And in part because it's a really hard thing to see somebody sick and dying and suffering in some ways. It's very hard, not on the person, only on the person doing it, but the person who's caring for them. Because they suffer and you're suffering, they can't stop it. You can alleviate it, but they can't stop it. And there's a powerlessness, and there's a self and awareness that comes with it, and there's a sense of deep human frailty that's brought out in a way that, as I began before I started the class, we're talking about social media, it's not there at all. That's why people are gravitated toward it. It makes them feel immortal. So Gerasim represents a very authentic way of life, and everyone else in the novella, and literally everyone else, is a very superficial, shallow, artificial sort of life. They've contrived it. It's almost like a conspiracy that they're all in on. Let's not talk about death. Right? We'll do everything to avoid it. They are very shallow. They're very materialistic. They're very narcissistic. And Ivan was the worst of the whole bunch. He was the biggest narcissist of all. But then he married another narcissist. And his friends in the law practice were narcissists. And basically everyone was a narcissist. And they were so superficial that they didn't want to face this aspect of human nature, which is embarrassing for them, uncomfortable. And what that unfortunately does to them is it hides from their sight the meaning of life, and it leaves them terrified and unprepared for death, even though they know that it's coming. So the reason I like to do this novella on the course is because when you're your age, you don't think you can die. If you were anything like me. It's just, particularly if you're a young man, because as I say, young men are particularly stupid. Sorry, guys. And then they get older, and then they remain stupid. It doesn't change. Hopefully it does. It comes with suffering to some degree. But men are very good at insulating and keeping out the noise. It's compartmentalizing. It's very useful and very important to be able to focus. But the focus should include death. If you don't have death within your focus, then you're not living your life in an authentic way, because you're denying the one thing that is going to be most important in your life. Note that the literature that we've studied throughout from the beginning of the course has always dealt with the reality of death and how you live your life in the light of the fact that death is coming. And the hero is somebody who not only goes down to death but rises from it with some sort of a transformative vision on what life means in light of the fact that death is coming. So the modern view of talking about life and excluding death is folly. It lacks wisdom. It's built on hopium. You might hope that you're going to die. You may try and, in Silicon Valley right now, tech millionaires or billionaires are spending a lot of money to keep themselves permanently young, trying to at any rate. I don't need to go into all that, but it's a movement called transhumanism, trying to extend human life infinitely. It's funny that it's the tech billionaires that gravitate towards that. It's not accidental. And you can do it through, injections and all that sort of stuff. The appearance of life. But then you end up like Bilbo Baggins, like butter spread out over too much bread, because you get old inside, even if the outside doesn't quite look the same way. But it's a very shallow life. It hides life's meaning, and it leaves you terrified at the moment of death, whereas the authentic life, which is represented by Gerasim, he's a minor character, by the way. He's not major. He comes into his own in the final 4 chapters. Is marked by pity for others and compassion. Just think like Bilbo when he didn't slay Gollum. It was pity that stayed his hand. And it changed his life. It made him a different character. And that pity and compassion for somebody who was dying just as he would die made him live his life in a different way as well. It's a very Christian message, in a sense. So when people talk about who are not Christian, as I was once not, about Christianity as delusional and built on, myths and not facing reality and pie in the sky when you die and stuff like that, you have any idea what you're talking about? You clearly don't. This is just, again, another way of avoiding the uncomfortable topic of death, which Christianity is all about. The meaning of death. Given the fact that the person in front of you is dying and is sick, and you are dying and you are sick, it allows you to build authentic relationships with other people. Solidarity. And it breaks the isolation. I talked about solipsism, the sense that you're alone in this world and nobody cares. So that human touch, the compassion, like Gerasim will literally be pushing his legs up against him when he's in pain and trying to alleviate his suffering, and talk to him as if he's a midwife, as if he's giving birth to something. What he's giving birth to, by the way, is himself, a different sense of himself. Very interesting image there. So rather than empty, superficial, and materialistic, we have a deep, authentic, compassionate, and ultimately meaningful life. Even when he's on his deathbed at the end of his life, he has a sense of a light breaking in. I'll get to that later on. And Gerasim's not afraid of death because he doesn't see death as the end of his life. That's why. All the others do. Every other character sees death as that's it, you're gone. If that's what you think, you can't handle death. Then that is what they think. That's why they don't want to face it, because there's no more of me. I can't bear to think of it. Gerasim knows that death is not the end of his life, and therefore he can live his life unafraid of death, which makes him a very powerful individual. Confident, courageous, compassionate. Doesn't think his time is wasted with other people, because it's not wasted. Because you can't waste time. If you live life in the reality of the meaning of the suffering and the death and the resurrection of Christ, then the time you spend with people in their room, which is very long, is meaningful. And it makes your suffering meaningful. If you suffer, by the way, I used to do apologetics in churches as well. One of the great problems is the problem of pain. Like the meaning of suffering, people find it very, very difficult. Why would God create a world in which suffering happened and death and so forth? Christianity is the only religion that actually speaks to this in any way significant at all. If somebody is suffering, you sometimes can tell them why they are, but often you can't. Like if somebody has cancer or whatever, or somebody gets killed in an accident or terrible things happen. What you can say to them, and it is comforting, is that because Christ suffered and God used suffering and did not avoid suffering, your suffering has meaning. However much it thwarts you and frustrates you and hurts you, it is for your good. In some way, it's for your good. We talk about 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and so forth, and compassion and so forth there. But that's there. He's confident in the correctness of his life. He's unafraid of getting involved. The others don't want to get involved in this man's death. His wife says that he suffered terribly. How bad was it? She could hear his cries 3 rooms away through closed doors. That's how bad it was. I don't know if you find that funny or not, but she doesn't want to hear his suffering. So she closes the door and closes it again and closes another one, and she can still hear his cries. So she's not talking about his suffering, she's complaining that she can't shut it out. That's how she relates to it. Whereas Gerasim is in there with him. So it's an extraordinary thing. And he's able to lessen his pain not by actually diminishing the pain, but by sharing it. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't heal it, he shares it. He's not alone. There's somebody there with him. Again, without getting off on my hobby horse with the COVID thing, the worst thing is people died and their relatives couldn't be with them. Made me furious. Pastors couldn't go in visiting people on their deathbed. Horrid. Monstrous. So the authentic life is in Tolstoy's presentation. I'm going to get through it specifically. I'm just laying out the outline first class. The authentic life of compassion is the way to live your life. And that's what he is strongly encouraging us to consider. And for his audience, it's a message that they don't want to hear for the same reasons. But it is inevitable. Death is inevitable. And he tries to bargain. He tries to deny it. He gets angry. He hopes that he might recover. All those sorts of things. He goes through stages of grief along the way, and we go with him, and we're hopeful. Except for the fact that we know that he's already dead. You know the outcome of this story, because the outcome of the story is at the beginning of the story. Have you ever thought, I've never thought about it this way, but can you imagine that you knew the day you were going to die? Can you imagine that you knew that, and then given that, how would you live now? That's been presented in films and books and so forth. You do very funny things. It would be a bit like Groundhog Day, right? You ever seen Groundhog Day? Bill Murray? Oh, you watch Groundhog Day. It's interesting. Because at first he does some funky things. He learns to play the piano, and he does all sorts of things. And he does immoral things, and he ends up awake the next day at the same time exactly, same day. He kills himself, wakes up the next morning, and is like, I can't change. No matter what I do, I can't change the fact that I'm going to wake up the next morning. So imagine, since death is going to come, how are you going to live in the day you have? But he will have to transform from a man who wants to avoid the question to a man who knows he can't avoid the question and comes to accept that it is something he must come to terms with. And that the reader goes along with that. It's why it's a philosophical novel. It's very deeply, it's wisdom literature, just like Ecclesiastes. There are different types of wisdom literature, by the way. So Proverbs is one type, and that deals with living a virtuous way as opposed to an immoral way. Choose life rather than choose death. Ecclesiastes is another form, the vanity of life, and another is Job, which even deals more closely with suffering. Suffering and wisdom literature go together. Again, why Odysseus is such a figure of wisdom, because he's long suffering. It brings a certain gravitas to people. This is why church elders are supposed to be older. The age, it's not the age, it's the wisdom that should come with it. Anyway, comments or questions at this point? If you haven't read it, and you may not have at this point, please do. It's a transformative book. It's not that long. How long is it here? So 87. Yeah, 144. So it's about 60. But it is really good. I'd encourage you to read it aloud as well. Let me just begin with the first chapter.